In the oldest districts of overcrowded cities, where light fails to reach and human misery compounds without release, something begins to form. This is Gengar, not born, manifested. It does not hatch from an egg or descend from a genetic lineage. It emerges from psychological residue, coalescing in places where stress saturates the walls themselves. Fewer than 1 in 20 vapor stage entities survive long enough to stabilize. Most dissolve within hours of formation, never achieving coherence. This is the life cycle of a creature that should not exist. And what happens to cities when it fails to form? In densely populated human environments, prolonged psychological distress generates measurable atmospheric byproducts. Elevated cortisol exhalation, disrupted sleep vapor, chronic fear pheromones. These compounds accumulate in poorly ventilated spaces where human suffering concentrates without dispersal. Hospitals, prisons, overcrowded tenements, underground transit stations during prolonged service failures. These are not random haunting sites. They are emergence zones. When saturation reaches a critical threshold, the vapor itself begins to organize. Molecules that individually carry no animating property start clustering into self-sustaining patterns. Scientists call this spontaneous affective condensation. The result is Gastly, a diffuse cloud of loosely coherent matter suspended between gas and intention. The process requires weeks or months of uninterrupted accumulation. A single day of ventilation, sunlight, or population dispersal resets the cycle entirely. This is why emergence occurs almost exclusively in spaces humans cannot easily abandon. The entity does not choose to form. It is precipitated by conditions. The first ghost is always an accident of architecture and despair. A newly formed Gastly is not yet an organism. It is a probability. The vapor cloud possesses minimal cohesion. Its boundaries fluctuate constantly, expanding and contracting with air currents, temperature shifts, and nearby emotional activity. A strong draft can scatter its constituent particles beyond recovery. A sudden absence of stress input causes gradual thinning until nothing measurable remains. Field monitoring in active emergent zones confirms that most Gastly dissipate within the first 48 hours. They lack the density to resist environmental forces and the energy reserves to survive even brief interruptions in their atmospheric supply. Survival during this phase depends entirely on location stability. Entities that form in sealed basements, abandoned elevator shafts, or bricked-over rooms persist longer than those in semi-public corridors. Movement is impossible. The Gastly is anchored to its formation site, feeding passively on whatever residue continues to accumulate. Those that endure begin a slow process of internal organization. The vapor thickens, circulation patterns emerge. Something resembling a boundary starts to hold. Most never reach this threshold. They fade before they are ever fully real. Light is not merely uncomfortable for early-stage entities. It actively dismantles what little structure they have. Photon exposure accelerates molecular dissociation within the vapor body. Ultraviolet wavelengths are most damaging, but even ambient visible light causes measurable boundary erosion over time. A Gastly exposed to direct sunlight for more than a few minutes will lose cohesion entirely. This forces absolute dependency on darkness. The entity must remain within shadowed zones continuously, migrating only when shadows shift or artificial lighting changes. Its existence is dictated by the geometry of light avoidance. Simultaneously, the Gastly requires ongoing emotional input. The same stress compounds that triggered its formation remain its primary energy source. Without proximity to distressed humans, metabolic processes slow and structural integrity weakens. The creature cannot simply hide in darkness, it must hide in occupied darkness. This creates a narrow survival corridor. The entity needs spaces that are both light-sealed and human-adjacent. Walls become critical. The Gastly presses into corners, ceiling joints, and the undersides of furniture, feeding on the anxiety that seeps through plaster and floorboards. It is not haunting, it is metabolic dependency. The ghost needs the living more than they know. After weeks of sustained feeding, the vapor body begins to change. Internal density gradients form. The previously uniform cloud develops regions of greater and lesser concentration. Core mass accumulates near what will become the center of the organism, while peripheral vapor thins and retracts. This is the first stage of morphological commitment. The entity is no longer an undifferentiated gas. It is organizing into something with structure. Limb analogues emerge next. Concentrated vapor extensions push outward from the central mass, not as biological appendages but as semi-stable projections capable of limited interaction with solid matter. These proto-limbs cannot grasp or strike with force, but they can brush surfaces, press against barriers, and test the boundaries of physical space. Scientists classify this transitional phase as haunter stage morphology. The creature remains majority vapor but has achieved partial solidity. It can now move independently of air currents, albeit slowly. It can choose to approach or retreat rather than simply drifting. Critically, the haunter can now leave its formation site. The dependency on a single location breaks. Movement through connected dark spaces becomes possible. Freedom removes the anchor that kept it alive. Every movement now carries risk. To survive movement at all, a haunter stage entity abandons corridors and claims the vertical. Stairwells, elevator shafts, ventilation columns, and utility risers become primary transit corridors. These structures offer continuous shadow, minimal human foot traffic, and connections between multiple floors of occupied space. The entity can access diverse feeding zones without ever crossing an illuminated threshold. Vertical navigation also reduces exposure time. Moving between floors takes seconds compared to the minutes required to traverse hallways. The haunter learns to exploit the architecture of human buildings in ways their designers never anticipated, but navigation errors are common and often fatal. A wrong turn into a lit corridor causes immediate boundary damage. A sealed fire door can trap the entity in an isolated shaft where no emotional residue accumulates. A sudden elevator activation may force the haunter into a reflexive retreat that scatters its loosely held form. Field researchers tracking haunter stage movement patterns note that most individuals establish fixed vertical routes within days. They do not explore freely. They identify safe paths and repeat them exactly, minimizing exposure to unknown geometries. Those that fail to establish stable routes eventually make a critical navigation error. The architecture that enables movement is also the architecture that kills. As the entity matures, its sensitivity to light sharpens to an extreme degree. A haunter in advanced development can detect photon gradients through solid barriers. It senses the warmth signature of an incandescent bulb behind a closed door. It registers the faint ultraviolet bleed from fluorescent fixtures 2 rooms away. This is not vision. It is a form of radiative proprioception, an awareness of light as a spatial threat rather than a visual input. Simultaneously, non-visual tracking of human presence becomes precise. The entity detects bioelectric fields, exhaled stress compounds, and the subtle vibrations of restless sleep through floors and walls. It knows where humans are without seeing them. It knows their emotional state without contact. These dual refinements allow efficient hunting. The haunter positions itself in optimal shadow zones adjacent to high-output individuals, maximizing energy intake while minimizing exposure risk. It no longer feeds passively on ambient accumulation. It selects targets. This is the transition from parasite to predator. The entity now moves with intention, tracking specific humans through architectural space. The haunting is no longer accidental, it is strategic. The final transformation is not dramatic. It is a threshold crossed in stillness. After months of sustained feeding and structural consolidation, the entity's mass fluctuation ceases. the constant expansion and contraction that characterized earlier stages stabilizes into a fixed density. The boundary between the creature and surrounding air becomes definite, no longer blurred by vapor drift. This is density lock, the point at which the organism achieves permanent cohesion. Morphology finalizes simultaneously. The central mass rounds into a stable core. The limb projections thicken into functional appendages capable of exerting physical force. The creature's surface, once gaseous, now resists touch rather than yielding to it. Scientists classify this stage as full Gengar morphology. The entity is no longer vulnerable to minor air currents, brief light exposure, or temporary feeding interruptions. It has metabolic reserves. It has structural redundancy. It can sustain damage and recover. The adult Gengar is not invincible. Sustained light exposure, prolonged isolation from human populations, or catastrophic physical disruption can still destroy it. But these are exceptional circumstances. Once density locks, the city is no longer waiting it out. Adulthood brings a behavioral shift that researchers initially mistook for preference. It is now understood as compulsion. A mature Gengar becomes fixed to a specific structure or district. It does not wander. It does not explore new territories. It remains within a defined range, typically a single building or a cluster of connected structures, for the remainder of its existence. This fixation is not psychological attachment, it is metabolic calibration. Over months of residency, the Gengar's energy intake becomes tuned to the specific emotional signatures of its territory's occupants. Their stress patterns, their sleep cycles, their chronic anxieties become the entity's baseline food supply. Relocation disrupts this calibration. A Gengar forced into unfamiliar territory cannot efficiently process the new population's emotional output. Feeding becomes erratic. Structural stability wavers. Many relocated individuals undergo partial dissociation within weeks. Field removals confirm this. Gengar extracted from long-term territories and released elsewhere rarely survive the transition. They do not adapt, they simply fade. The ghost is not loyal to the building, the ghost is dependent on it. The territory is not a home, it is a life support system. Gengar do not reproduce through biological means, they reproduce through influence. A mature, stable Gengar generates a persistent field of low-level psychic static. Humans within range experience mildly elevated anxiety, disturbed sleep, and a vague sense of being observed. These effects are subtle but cumulative. Over time, this sustained stress output increases ambient psychological residue in surrounding spaces. The Gengar does not create offspring directly. It creates the conditions under which new Gastly may spontaneously emerge. Seeding is inefficient. Most influenced areas never reach the saturation threshold required for emergence. Ventilation, population turnover, and periodic building maintenance disperse accumulated residue before condensation can occur. When emergence does succeed, the new entity has no connection to its progenitor. There is no parental bond, no inherited memory, no recognition. The juvenile Gastly begins its existence in the same precarious state as any other, with the same low probability of survival. The Gengar does not raise its successors. It merely makes their existence statistically possible. Remove Gengar from a city, and accumulation begins immediately. Human stress compounds do not dissipate passively. They saturate enclosed spaces, concentrate in neglected structures, and compound across generations of occupancy. Without a metabolic sink, this residue builds toward thresholds that correlate with elevated rates of psychological crisis, violence, and social collapse. Gengar function as processors. They absorb and metabolize what humans cannot vent through normal means. A single mature individual can stabilize an entire building's emotional atmosphere, reducing ambient tension to levels that fall below conscious perception. When Gengar populations decline, whether through light-based eradication, structural demolition, or forced relocation, affected districts deteriorate, incident reports rise, occupancy rates fall. The architecture itself becomes inhospitable in ways that defy conventional explanation. The ghost is not the disease. The ghost is the immune response. Cities do not tolerate Gengar out of ignorance. They depend on them. From formless vapor to silent regulator, this is the Gengar lineage. Born from what we cannot bear, sustained by what we cannot release,